Metroid Dread is colorful, fun, has good gameplay, a proper return to the Metroid franchise that old fans and new fans have been waiting for. And yes, it can be very challenging at times. This is a review of Metroid Dread. Now, before you go, oh, wait a minute, didn't you make a YouTube short saying Metroid Dread wasn't hard? To that, I would respond that words matter. What I said was, it's not an easy game by any means. It is going to test your abilities, but it's not an overly difficult or unfair game once you get a hang of it. It is not unfair nor overly difficult. What I mean by that is that the game does a relatively good job of telling you what's about to come. In fact, I'd say early on in the game, it gets a little too hand-holdy, literally using words and text, and sometimes even literally stopping gameplay to show you a new mechanic. Actually, it does that for every single power-up you receive in the game. It's not quite as intrusive with every single enemy, with maybe the exception of the EMMI you encounter, but you can only defeat those with a temporary power upgrade that's basically built exclusively to defeat them. And that's what I mean, there isn't a ton of guesswork when it comes to new enemies or a boss. Almost every section of the map has a power-up that you can then leverage for that area's boss, besides the very obvious blocked off points that you need that upgrade for in order to progress. But before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about what this game is like for someone who isn't super in tune with the Metroid franchise and its lore. I want to do that because it's no secret that the Metroid games in terms of Nintendo franchises aren't quite as popular or sell as heavily as games like Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon. That's not to say that Metroid games aren't good or don't have fans. Obviously, there was an untapped demand for these games since Dread has sold so well, and still, there are people who aren't as familiar. While the game does a solid job of introducing the mechanics of this game compared to a platformer like Mario, there is still a bit of a learning curve if you aren't super familiar with Metroidvanias. That is to say, a platformer or side-scroller that has interconnected maps with an intertwined progression system for your character and its locations. And of course, secret rooms and areas. Basically, you'll get power-ups and you will use those to return to sections of the game you've already been through to get to new areas and then repeat. Not a novel concept for many of you, I'm sure, but still, the context is important for newcomers. One of the bigger differentiators that the Metroid franchise uses to separate itself from the field is the destroyable walls, floors, and ceilings that will help you progress even if it seems like you're stuck at times. Don't worry, the game also does a good job of telling you this is a thing both explicitly and implicitly. As far as the story goes, here's where it gets a little more obtuse. If you're worried about spoilers, don't be. I'm saving that for the end and it'll be marked in the video so you can skip it. But again, if you're new to the franchise or simply haven't kept up with the lore expanded upon previous titles, don't worry. The game still is mostly self-contained that you don't need to know everything about it to enjoy it. Until the very end, where the only thing you'll really potentially miss out on is the big payoff that feels a little extra cooler if you have known the story, otherwise it's still pretty cool. The game actually does a decent amount of exposition to get you relatively up to speed, which is nice considering that Samus is mainly a silent protagonist. Look, there's a ton of lore videos that dive deeper if you really want to get fully up to speed, but this is the review of Dread, so here are the basics. You play as Samus Aran, a bounty hunter that in previous games has killed off the remaining Metroids created by the Chozo, which was an old but highly technologically advanced race of bird-like creatures that also happened to raise Samus and created her suit. Throughout her adventures, she eventually has some Metroid DNA merged within her to give her immunity to the X-Parasite, which is basically a parasite that takes over entire populations very quickly, which she also then rids the galaxy of, or so we thought. The game starts off with Samus being dispatched by the Galactic Federation to the planet ZDR after their EMMI robots went offline after they were sent to the planet to get rid of some of the remnants of the X-Parasite. Once there, you encounter a mysterious Chozo warrior who then briefly fights Samus, strips her of her abilities, closes access to her ship, and you start the game in the depths of ZDR. Pretty standard Metroid premise. Get your powers back, investigate what's up with the EMMI, get back to your ship, figure out what's going on with the X-Parasite and the Chozo warrior. A compelling enough motive for a player to get going. Also, I just have to say, even though Samus doesn't actually say anything throughout the game, the way her character is animated provides plenty of sass and badassery. In cutscenes before and after fights, the way Samus stands, points her cannon, shoots enemies, there's plenty of expression to her character without dialogue, which I think works great. Now, Metroid Dread does a pretty good job of incorporating modern game mechanics and blending close combat with range combat. Of course, range combat is the primary method of gameplay. Samus points, you shoot. I'd say it's not quite as tight as games like Hollow Knight or Celeste. I know, those come up time and time again, but they're literally modern masterpieces of the form. But honestly, it doesn't have to be due to the difference in playstyle. In fairness, Dread isn't as clunky or as slow-paced as it may have been in the past, so in that sense it's probably a little easier to start with something like this, since those other two require more refined and precise inputs. In some ways, towards the end of the game you actually have a little more mobility thanks to Space Jump, which is an infinite double jump ability, but you don't really have that for most of your gameplay. Spin Boost, the standard double jump, is what you'll be accustomed to, although input is not perfect. It's one of the few issues I have with Dread's gameplay. Because it does incorporate modern, faster paced mechanics with a double jump, a dash, wall jumps, it feels weird to have a double jump limited to both only when you're in spinball mode and to only allow additional jumps to happen when your arch trajectory is on the way down. It simply causes frustration when you miss input or miss time abilities, not because of an enemy, but simply because it's a gameplay decision incorporated to the mechanic itself. Of course, more experienced players may argue that it's actually tight mechanics, but for the jump specifically, I don't know why the game simply didn't allow Samus to jump up when you do the additional input. That way you maintain jump and shoot fidelity without forcing the player to jump in motion when you want to avoid an enemy. The way it currently does it actually moves you forward before you can enter that additional jump phase, most likely causing you to break flow if you do hit a fired item or the enemy itself. Maybe it's a little nitpicky, but I guess once you get a hang of it, it's just another thing to be mindful of. The game definitely rewards a more methodical style of play. Learn your surroundings, watch for enemy and boss attack patterns, and then react to that. You will most certainly be chaining your abilities as you gain them, and the game knows it, providing good variance to each boss, area, and set of enemies. That's not to say that you can't play in a more aggressive run and gun playstyle. That's actually the way I play, but definitely be prepared to die a lot if that's the case.
Okay. Oh my god.
Eventually, you'll find that you have to use your latest ability at least once for the boss in the area you received it in, although it's not absolutely necessary if you do any of the game's sequence breaks, which we'll touch on in a bit. As far as difficulty goes, here's why I don't think it's over the top or unfair. In games like Dark Souls, where even normal exploration can and will be treacherous, hidden death traps that there's no way of knowing are there until you run into them and so on, Metroid Dread almost never puts you in a spot where you don't know you're about to die. Even in areas where you clearly lack the suit upgrades to progress in, your screen is hit with instant feedback, sound, and slow enough life training that you know, oh, I can't go here yet, I should go back. The platforming and light puzzles are relatively simple to figure out, so even if you feel like you ran into a dead end, usually a bit of shooting everywhere or later in the game, dropping bombs in corners and walls will open a path forward fairly quickly. The difficulty spikes are pretty much exclusively locked to bosses and mini-bosses. That's where your patience more than anything will be tested, because once you learn the attack patterns, you find that it's a game of dealing damage patiently, moving on to the next sequence, and boom. In fact, once you learn the patterns, you'll find that those battles don't rage on for more than a few minutes each. It's just the gameplay loop of dying, going back, and learning that takes the most time. That's why the game provides you with a hard mode after you beat it, where you can improve your own mechanics to take the least amount of damage as possible and really perfect its combat. Again, I'm not saying that you won't be tested or get frustrated. There's definitely a section or two where you get tossed in back-to-back mini-bosses and boss sequences that aren't that far apart from each other, and it can certainly drive up the anxiety. But that's what I think makes it fun. It feels rewarding and so cathartic to finally get through. You get an additional layer of confidence, and if you encounter a similar mini-boss again, like the Chozo Soldiers, it feels like so much more of a badass combat dance and you start to welcome the challenge. As for the section with EMMI, that was one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game. Samus is a straight badass for a character with basically no dialogue, but the areas with EMMI add a very real sense of tension that makes you really think and react on the fly. It incorporates slight stealth gameplay in those areas, but each EMMI gets progressively faster and smarter, so you really have to pick your spots with the Omega Cannon, which is the only way to defeat them. They're not quite as spooky as the game's title or the trailers would suggest, but you will definitely die to them a few times, so it's just another enemy you need to learn attack patterns from before you get the temporary power upgrade to defeat them. Alright, spoiler time, so if you don't want the end of the game spoiled for you, this is your warning to skip ahead to the last section of the video. Okay? So, for everyone that's beat it and the people that don't care about spoilers, here we go. Dude, I just want to talk about that last fight with Ravenbeak. It's so good, and even though it's tough, it played like an epic battle between two extremely powerful warriors. It's not like Samus had to get lucky and pick your spots, well, at least not all the time, and only shoot at weak points. It's a satisfying final battle that shows Samus back to full strength and actually being able to go toe-to-toe with whom we discovered is kind of her father. I say kind of because, like he revealed, she has some of his DNA. But the way that we find out that the final network station Atom AI is actually Ravenbeak and has been forcing Samus along to awaken her Metroid DNA was very well done. I mean, you kind of figured that out in the second half, but still, it worked for me. That final Metroid suit is so cool. I don't know what exactly happened with that X-Parasite at the end to offset it, but I'm excited to see where Nintendo takes that ability in future games. It was short and sweet, but it felt so cool to obliterate everything in your path as you escape to your ship, so I really hope this suit and ability makes a comeback at some point. Metroid Dread is not a super long game. I beat it without collecting every item in just under 8 hours, and that's where there have been some complaints about this game being a full $60. Now, I don't want to go on a huge tangent here, but I think there's a couple of things happening here. 1. Review culture has put a race on almost every major outlet to get their review up before everyone else in order to get the most clicks and views. I'm not putting the blame entirely on them because, like it or not, this practice is done because it works. For as many vocal comments and players that exist that say, ugh, reviewers aren't playing the games properly, there's almost an infinitely greater number of people that don't write a comment and they just click on the first link that appears and go. Second, older gamers seem to forget that just because they can buy every single new game that comes out doesn't mean that everyone can. So while yes, you should play a game however you want, games like this one are designed for multiple playthroughs. Replayability is a thing, and just because you might have a backlog of games you're trying to speed through doesn't mean everyone does. And that replayability isn't in the sense that, oh, you have to beat this game 10 times to get the real ending. Dread is actually very good at giving you the full experience if you do decide to do one playthrough. Bonus content is just that. Bonus, a nice to see additional piece of concept art and so on. On top of that, it means that you can go back and try different sequence breaks to see what abilities you can actually skip, different paths to sections of the map to reach the end, and even hidden ways to defeat bosses. This is super cool for the kid whose parents can only afford one game at a time, and Dread offers true replayability that significantly extends its playtime. And even if you don't have time to replay the game, isn't a shorter game preferred in that instance? If we want to have a conversation on Nintendo's pricing practices, we can and should do that. But it's not like price gouging is new to Nintendo. Nostalgia blurs our vision sometimes, and Nintendo has been nickel and diming gamers for a long time. It just so happens that they usually also provide excellent games to play that we accept that trade-off, compared to an indie developer making a great game and using cheaper price points to break into the scene. Okay, tangent over, but that's my stance on price and playtime. Metroid Dread has been in development hell for a long time, so now that it's finally out, it has plenty of Easter eggs for older fans, solid pacing, and the minor issues I have with its gameplay doesn't take away from the fact that it's still pretty good gameplay. It's a really nice way to put a bow on this story arc, and while it doesn't necessarily mean anything for it, makes me very excited for Metroid Prime 4. As of right now, I think Metroid Dread is one of 2 videos that deserves Game of the Year, although I would slightly give the edge to Returnal on PS5. If I had to give Metroid Dread a score, I'm gonna go with Donkey System and rate this 4 out of 5.